At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. I've been fortunate enough to visit and travel extensively around Greece. Yet even if you lived here, there still wouldn't be enough time to journey through the full length of its remarkably long history. So I'm going to look at what Greece was like at the time the first apostles of Christianity were setting out to tell their amazing story to the world. Of course, I'm going to encounter some ancient history along the way, and a lot of modern Greece too, as it's one of the world's leading tourist destinations. Oh, did I mention the food? The culture? The sunshine? Or the beaches? Like so many of the 21 million tourists who flock here each year, I'm going to start in the Greek capital, Athens, probably one of the most recognizable cities on the planet, and a place where history is deeply embedded in every square meter. Then we're going to head north to the region of Macedonia, which is where St. Paul first set foot on European soil. Our next stop is the area southwest of Athens called the Peloponnese, which is perhaps most famous for somewhere called Olympia. But I'm particularly interested in the equally ancient city of Corinth. And then finally, you can't come to Greece and not visit some of its famous islands. So we're heading for a group called the Dodecanese, which includes Patmos. Patmos has all the vital ingredients of a Greek island: blue sky, blue ocean, whitewashed buildings, beaches, historical ruins, and an old port. But it was here that while in exile, St. John glimpsed into the far future and wrote the powerfully apocalyptic last book of the Bible called Revelation. So, Patmos is probably also the perfect place to end our journey through the ancient Bible destinations of Greece. But right now, let's get started in Athens. Even if you've never been here before, there are probably more famous ancient sites than you'll recognize immediately. And of course, they were all here when St. Paul arrived in the city in AD 50, on his own and very much a man on a mission. Joining us is Dr. Michael Scott, Associate Professor in Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick.
I've been studying and teaching about the ancient Greeks for years, and they really are an extraordinary force in world history. The creators of the first Olympic Games, the creators of democracy, philosophy, of drama. Our world would simply not be the same without the ancient Greeks. And they knew it, and so did many of the cultures who came after them in the Mediterranean world, even the Romans, who really thought they knew a thing or two. They knew when they were beat as well. One of the great Roman poets, Horace, said this: "Captured Greece, captured her uncouth conqueror." The Greeks, and especially the Athenians, knew that they were important people, and so they were a tough audience.
And the message that Paul wanted to give them went against pretty much everything they had held dear for centuries. When you start to appreciate what he was up against in Athens, essentially an unknown loner challenging millennia of cultural practice and ideas, you begin to get an idea of just how deep was Paul's conviction about the story he had to tell, and just how much courage was needed to actually do the telling. As we visit Athens' many historic sites, we'll encounter St. Paul more than a few times. But first, let's have a look at what life is like here today. Modern Athens is home to around 3.8 million people, But many more millions of tourists visit the city every year. So it's hard not to bump into a few of them along the way. Like here on Lycovitosh Hill, which provides panoramic views across Athens to the Aegean Sea. In Greek mythology, the rocky hill was created by the goddess Athena, and at one time it was topped by a temple dedicated to Zeus. It's hard to believe now, but at the time of liberation from the Ottomans, Lycovitosh was completely bare. Reforestation commenced in 1880 and was completed in 1915. Winding your way back down to the centre of Athens, you'll come to Syntagma Square, the home of Greece's parliament and really the birthplace of modern Greece. An impressive marble war memorial was built in front of the parliament to commemorate the greatest battles of the modern Greek army since independence. In its centre is depicted a slain soldier, and the monument is guarded day and night by a select troop of young soldiers known as Evzones. Here they are in their distinctive uniforms, performing the hourly changing of the guard with such discipline and precision. These uniforms also have historical significance, as they're based on the ones worn by the Kleftes, who were mountain-based freedom fighters. So this square is not just geographically at the heart of Athens, but it's historically at the heart of modern Greece. And if you want to enjoy it in style, you can stay right here in the rather grand Hotel Grande Bretagne. It became so popular with visiting celebrities, politicians, and even royalty, it became known as the Greek state's official guest house. There are just so many levels of history in Athens. You're never very far away from some aspect of it. So here, in the Monastiraki district, the narrow streets and neoclassical-style small buildings are characteristic of the Ottoman times. And in the Monastiraki Square is the 10th century Byzantine Padanasa church, which once belonged to the monastery that gives this district its name. Another era in history is represented by the 18th century mosque that also stands on this square. But in addition to plenty of history, Monastiraki is also known for the sheer variety of its little shops, and perhaps more importantly for tourists, its food stalls and restaurants. There can't be a more evocative place to sample gyros, which is one of Greece's more popular takeaway food, served with chips. In Greece, gyros essentially means turn, as the meat in this traditional snack is cooked on a vertical spit. If you're ready for a more substantial meal, it's only a short walk to the Plaka district, the oldest neighborhood in Athens and particularly known for its more traditional tavernas. When St. Paul came to Athens in the summer of AD 50, the city was of course even smaller, but for him, travel certainly wasn't a luxury. Often it was a necessity. On quite a number of occasions he had to flee to avoid imprisonment or something worse, and he traveled to Athens on just such one of these occasions. He arrived by sea, the boat anchoring in Phalliro, then the main port for Athens. Today, if you arrive in Athens by ship, you'll dock here in Piraeus, which is right next door to Phalliro. Paul sailed to Athens from northern Greece after fleeing from Thessaloniki. He was escorted by unknown men, most likely sympathizers, who simply dropped him off and then returned north. What we do know is that now he was entirely on his own. Paul, being Paul, decided to make the most of the wait. The book of Acts in the New Testament tells us that Paul wasted no time before he was making his presence known in the city. He had noted immediately the number of idols that were being worshipped and was stunned to see one altar that was dedicated to an unknown god. The Athenians were hedging their bets just in case they'd overlooked the really important god. Paul's message was about the one and only God, so he could be forgiven for possibly expecting a receptive audience. That the Athenians were clearly open to new ideas might have also encouraged him, and initially at least, he was indeed given a hearing. We're also told in Acts that Paul was preaching, and I quote, "in the marketplace day by day." That marketplace would almost certainly have been here at the ancient Agora, although it wouldn't have been called ancient in those days.
The basic translation of agora is marketplace. And of course it was that. People came from all over Athens to gather their goods, buy whatever it is they wanted, and get their water from the public fountain. But it was also so much more than that. This was where the democratic institutions of Athens were. This is where the business took place. It was also a religious space. The Athenians had their altar of the 12 gods in the agora. And it was also a legal space. This is where the law courts were, dispensing justice over 250 days a year. And when the era of the classical world had ended and the Hellenistic world began, the monarchs of the wider Mediterranean world wanted their place in this crucial space. They built beautiful buildings, stoas, places in which people could walk, discuss, debate, think. And when the Roman emperors came to power, they too wanted to build in the agora. Augustus set up an Odeon, a place to speak and to be heard. So when Paul came to Athens, the agora was the obvious place to go.
It was a place of the people, the equivalent of the Roman Forum. And from the word agora, we get agoraphobia, meaning a fear of going into places where there are lots of people. When Paul was here, the agora's large square would have been surrounded by many government buildings, and everywhere he looked were the temples and altars to the myriad of pagan gods worshipped by the Athenians. And here's one of them, the beautifully preserved temple of Hephaestus, also called the Theseion. Inside it housed statues to both Hephaestus and Athena. It dates back to the middle of the 5th century BC and has survived largely as it was originally built over 2,500 years ago. It would have been surrounded by the small, busy workshops of potters, metalworkers, and sculptors. While it was built as a pagan temple, from the Middle Ages onward, it was a Christian church. The other impressive building on this site is the Stoa of Attalus. But this isn't the original because it was destroyed in the year 267. It was reconstructed in the early 1950s and today houses the Museum of the Ancient Agora. Because it's an absolutely faithful reproduction down to the very last detail, it's also often used in the study of ancient monuments. Completed in 159 BC and subsequently donated to the city by King Attalus II, the original was the world's first shopping mall and housed 21 shops on each of its 2 floors. Looking down across the ancient agora from the Acropolis, the sheer size of the Stoa is particularly apparent. The Temple of Hephaestus can be seen on the left, and the most prominent ruins in the center of this view are of the Odeon of Agrippa, which was built in 15 BC. Over the centuries, the agora was gradually abandoned and eventually built over, becoming a residential area. When excavations for the Athens to Piraeus rail line started in 1890, some of the first ruins were uncovered. Athletic competitions are one of the many concepts ancient Greece has given the modern world, including the Olympic Games, which have their origins in the ancient Panathenaic Games, dating back to 566 BC. And this is arguably the spiritual home of all athletics. The stadium looks exactly the way it would have looked back in 140 AD, although it was skillfully reconstructed from the ruins of the original. Perhaps not all that surprisingly, it's the only all-marble sports stadium in the world, and it's here that the first modern-era Olympics were held in 1896. Another ancient venue, still being used today, is this remarkable arena in the shadow of the Acropolis, called the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. It was built in 161 AD, seats 5,000 people, and today is the main venue for the annual Athens festival. Next door is an even bigger venue, the ancient theatre of Dionysus. And it was here that the innovative plays of the great Greek poets Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes had their premieres. At the time of Paul, Greece was actually under Roman rule and had been for 200 years. But Athens remained a free city because the Romans were so impressed with its schools. Hadrian, in particular, went on a building spree in the middle of the 2nd century AD. He paid for the completion of the temple of Olympian Zeus, which had remained unfinished for over 630 years. The remaining ruins are very impressive in themselves and give some idea of the colossal scale of the completed temple. Only 15 of the 104 columns remain standing, while there's a 16th on the ground. It fell down during a huge storm in 1852. Close by is Hadrian's Arch, which actually wasn't built by the emperor, but was named after him to acknowledge his contribution to the city, particularly the completion of Zeus's temple. On one side, an inscription credits Hadrian as the founder of the new Athens. On the other, facing the Acropolis, Theseus is acknowledged as the founder of the old city. Another Roman emperor, Vespasianus, wasn't quite so fortunate when it came to having things named after him. These are the ruins of the public lavatories in the Roman Agora, and they're called the Vespasianes. The Parthenon was a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, which must have made Paul shudder every time he saw it, although in practical terms it was mostly used as a treasury building. At the end of the 6th century AD, it became a Christian church, and then after the Ottoman invasion in 1456, it was occasionally used as a mosque. It wasn't until after Greek independence that the Parthenon became a protected monument, and serious attempts at restoration only commenced in 1975. It's still ongoing, as the constant presence of scaffolding and cranes attest. And among the many conservation issues is managing the hundreds of thousands of tourists who crawl over it every year. The sculptures considered most important or most at risk of damage, now mostly from atmospheric pollution, have been removed and are now on display in the new Acropolis Museum. These include some of the metopes, the frieze blocks above the architraves, which have been replaced with copies made of artificial stone. The friezes, carved in high relief, depict various mythical battles. The new Acropolis Museum is arguably one of the most remarkable museums in the world. The contrast of the modern and the ancient really is breathtaking, and it's built to the scale of the original. It doesn't disappoint on the inside either. There's over 4,000 square meters of ancient ruins in here. The main building is deliberately orientated to provide absolutely stunning views of the Parthenon. So it's sort of a museum within a museum. The restoration work performed here is painstaking and, not surprisingly, never-ending. Here, the caryatides are being cleaned using lasers so as to avoid any damage. These particular 5 statues served as columns on the smaller Erechtheian temple up on the Acropolis. Named after the sun god, Erechtheus, and completed in 420 BC, the Erechtheion stands on the exact spot where Athena was said to have planted her olive tree. Visiting the Acropolis is a memorable experience. The history is fascinating, and the views across Athens are stunning. If you can stay until sunset, you'll be treated with a magical sight as the monuments are rendered as silhouettes, and you really could be back in ancient times. Even if you're only in Athens for a short time, a tour of the Acropolis has to be a priority. Although, as you look out across everything else that the city has to offer, you'll want to stay longer. It's easy to see why Athens is one of the most popular tourist destinations on the planet. Paul's daily visits to the marketplace at the ancient agora soon attracted the attention of higher authorities. He was soon summoned to a meeting of the Areopagus Council. That meeting took place on Mars Hill, next to the Acropolis, with all its grand symbols of Greek civilization as the backdrop. The Areopagus was a council of aristocratic elders who were responsible for determining many administrative, religious, and educational matters. These were important people. And Mars Hill was a very significant site too, because it was here that the first Athenian citizen-based parliaments had assembled, giving birth to the notion of democratic decision-making and enshrining the right to freedom of speech as well as human equality. In the late 6th century BC, the Athenians managed to break the power of the aristocrats, and for the first time in history, the single citizen, regardless of status, could have a say in the running of the government. This was the birth of democracy. Demos meaning those of the land, and kratos meaning power. The assembly of the people was called the ecclesia, a word which specifically implies a gathering drawn together from many different places. Jesus used it in reference to his little group of followers, and the English derivative ecclesiastical is still used in reference to matters concerning the church. A key element of democracy was freedom of speech. And when your turn came in the ecclesia, you stood on a simple block of stone called a bema. And Paul would have stood on one as he addressed the Areopagic Council. Paul believed in destiny, and as he stood before this group of statesmen, he must have been even more convinced that he was in the right place at the right time. It was summer, so the sun would have been baking this rough outcrop of limestone rock. But Paul seized his opportunity, and here is what he told them. Now, what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. He then told them, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, that last bit really set the cat among the pigeons. The book of Acts tells us that some sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." Much more positively, though, we're told, a few men became followers of Paul and believed. One of these was even a member of the Areopagus. Paul must have felt he'd made some headway. As he left the council meeting and headed home, Paul would have undoubtedly have been very aware of this building, particularly its pagan associations. Today, it's one of the most recognizable man-made structures in the world. The Parthenon is the crowning glory of Athens' famous Acropolis, which is also called the Sacred Rock. Acropolis literally means high city, and there have been monuments on this flat-topped outcrop since the Neolithic era. But most of what is seen today dates from the 5th century BC.
If the Agora was the beating heart of Athens, then the Acropolis was its head. This was the place where the Athenians from the earliest days built their palaces, and then in the classical era, their temples to the city's patron deity, Athena. Tyrants built them, democrats built them, and over the years it became not just the religious head of the city, but its flagship. The Parthenon, the temple that sits on the Acropolis today, is still the most famous monument of Greece. It says Greece to the rest of the world. My favorite fact about it is this, that there's not a single straight line in the Parthenon. Because 2,500 years ago, the engineers and architects who constructed it understood that if they did build it with exactly straight lines, it would actually look to us wonky. 2,500 years ago, they were able to understand that and correct for the optical illusion just enough, with every line just slightly curved, so that it looks to us straight. This was the extraordinary nature of this extraordinary building, sitting on top of this incredible pinnacle at the heart of this most fantastic city.
Athens offers a rich palette of food, entertainment, culture, and art. There's just so much here. One visit is never going to be enough. Paul had mixed success in Athens, but importantly, his message had been heard, and there'd been some positive responses. He had done as much as he could for the moment, so it was time to move on. At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. Paul had mixed success in Athens, but importantly, his message had been heard, and there'd been some positive responses. He had done as much as he could for the moment, so it was time to move on. Paul may have left Athens a little frustrated at his lack of headway, but in reality he'd done important groundwork, and over the next 3 or 4 centuries, Christianity took hold in Greece very rapidly, leading to the great era of Greek Byzantium. Paul's arrival in Macedonia, a few months before he fled to Athens, represented the start of something truly momentous: the arrival of the Christian message on European soil. Paul went to Macedonia in the middle of AD 50, landing at the far eastern port of Kavala. Back then, it was called Neapolis, and Paul arrived here after sailing across the Aegean from Troas, in what is now modern Turkey. The journey took about 2 days, and Paul was acting on a vision in which he had seen a Macedonian man begging him for help. Paul believed this was God instructing him to head west across the Aegean Sea to preach the gospel.
Macedon, in the wilds of northern Greece, a place always thought of by the southern Greeks, the Athenians, as barbarous, as uncivilized. And yet it had huge amounts of latent power. It was rich in resources, in timber, in minerals. But it was politically fragmented for much of its history. That was until the 4th century BC, when Philip II of Macedon and his son, who would become Alexander the Great, came to power. Under Philip, Macedon became an absolutely dominating fighting force, and under Alexander, it became the capital of an empire that stretched all the way to the shores of the River Indus in India. And it was Macedon that the Romans, when they began to conquer the Mediterranean, first came into contact, both in diplomatic terms and in military terms. And in 146 BC, as a result, Macedon became the first Roman province in Greece.
Paul might have been convinced about what he had to do, but it was still very much a journey into the unknown. At that time, Macedonia was a Roman province. It continued to be disputed territory for centuries and only became part of Greece in 1913, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkan Wars. Today, it's the largest region of Greece and the second most populous, thanks to the port cities of Thessaloniki and Kavala. Kavala, where Paul first landed, is now a city with a population of over 70,000 people. It was founded at the end of the 7th century BC, and since then, it's been through the wars, quite literally. Not surprisingly then, fortresses, castles, and arsenals are key features of this now peaceful city, which is now the principal seaport of eastern Macedonia. Particularly notable is the Kamares, an imposing double-arch viaduct built in the Roman-Byzantine period and stretching 6 kilometers.
The Romans, as we all know, were great road builders, and the Via Egnatia was one of their finest creations. It stretched from the West Adriatic coast of Greece, went across northern Greece, across the top of the Aegean Sea, all the way to Byzantium, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. In total, about 1,120 kilometers long. And where it came to the Adriatic coast, on exactly the other side of the Adriatic Sea, that was where another very famous Roman road ended, the Via Appia, which started in the very heart of Rome itself. As a result, the Via Egnatia was part of a massive link that connected Rome and Constantinople.
Being a main road, parts of the Via Egnatia were around 6 meters in width with large stone slabs. It was built to last, and last it did, with parts of the original surviving to this day, including some of the sections on which Paul would have walked as he set out from Kavala on his way to Philippi. Philippi is only 14 kilometers northwest of Kavala, so it's likely Paul completed the trip in a day. The city is described in the Book of Acts as a Roman colony, and it was also known as Little Rome, such were its close imperial links. It would have been quite an alien place culturally for these traveling Jews, although Paul was actually a Roman citizen by birth.
The city of Philippi was founded by Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. And in 42 BC, it played host to one of the defining battles in Roman history, Mark Antony and Octavius versus Brutus and Cassius, the murderers of Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had taken over the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and Mark Antony and Octavius came with their legions from Rome to challenge Brutus and Cassius for supremacy. They met at Philippi, and there were 2 key battles. The first in early October was where Mark Antony tried to surprise Cassius by crossing marshy land and making an unprovoked attack on his camp. That was a success, and Cassius actually committed suicide when he accepted defeat. But Brutus, on the other hand, had been successful against Octavius. And so in late October, a second battle took place. Mark Antony and Octavius versus Brutus and the remaining forces. And in that conflict, Brutus was defeated and 2 committed suicide. Mark Antony and Octavius were now masters of the Roman world. It was an epoch-making moment in Roman history, but it was also an incredibly important moment for the town of Philippi. After the battle, it was turned into a Roman military veteran colony, and so by the 1st century AD, as a result, Philippi was, to all intents and purposes, a Roman town.
The remains of the Roman city are truly remarkable, providing a first-hand experience of what life would have been like here. Although many of these remains are of buildings from the 2nd century AD, so the layout wouldn't have been quite the same as when Paul visited. But he certainly would have walked along this section of the Via Egnatia as it passes through the city. Perhaps what's most interesting about the remains of ancient Philippi, though, is the ruins of a number of large Christian churches, rather unromantically known today as Basilica A, Basilica B, and Basilica C. These date from the 5th century AD and are an indication of just how quickly and solidly Christianity became established here. And there's more. Near the Forum are the remains of the octagonal church, built around AD 400 on the site of an earlier, very small chapel, which was most likely the first church in the city and was dedicated to St. Paul. Yet Paul didn't have a particularly happy time in Philippi, and neither did many of the early Christians who are known to have suffered horrific persecution, possibly including being thrown to hungry lions, which was a popular Roman method of executing criminals and dissenters during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Hellenistic theatre, which dates back to the time of Philip II, was renovated by the Romans in the 2nd century AD for exactly these activities. It could hold over 25,000 people, and it's hard to imagine just how terrifying it would have been to face a gory death in this arena. This part of the Forum at Philippi is where the important administrative buildings once stood. And it's here that Paul was brought before the ruling generals to explain his recent activities. He hadn't been in Philippi very long, but already he was making waves. It started just a few days earlier with the conversion of Lydia, who appears to have been a wealthy businesswoman of some standing. Paul encountered her and some friends here, just off the Via Egnatia, on the banks of the Corinth stream, where they were praying. The Book of Acts tells us that she dealt in purple cloth, which was a high-status material, and we also know she was Jewish, or, as the New Testament puts it, a worshipper of God. Paul seized the opportunity to relay the gospel story. Lydia was converted and baptized on the spot, making her the first European Christian. Today, this place is known simply as Lydia, and not far from the stream is the octagonal baptistry of St. Lydia, commemorating what was undoubtedly a momentous event in the history of Christianity. But it wasn't Lydia's conversion that got Paul into trouble. Later on, he met a slave girl who was a fortune teller, and she earned her masters a considerable amount of money from her predictions. After being converted and exorcised of the fortune-telling spirit, it was clear that this income was finished. So the owners wanted Paul punished. After appearing before the generals in the Forum, Paul and his companion Silas were thrown into jail. Then something astonishing happened. During the night, there was an earthquake, which, it's recorded in Acts, shook the foundations of the prison, causing all the doors to fly open and everybody's chains to be loosened. The jailer, convinced all his charges had escaped, prepared to commit suicide, until Paul reassured him that nobody had run away. The jailer immediately requested that he and his whole family be baptized. The ruins of the jail in ancient Philippi have been identified, so we can place exactly where the events described in Acts chapter 16 actually happened. What an interesting little group of converts Paul made in Philippi. A businesswoman, a slave girl, and a jailer. Not only had the gospel crossed from Asia into Europe, it had also bridged the divisions of gender, race, and social distinction. So, despite a severe flogging and a night in prison, Paul was probably satisfied with the outcomes of his short stay at Philippi. He would be back, but ahead lay a much bigger challenge, the city of Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki was founded by King Cassander of Macedon in 315 BC, and even in Paul's time was a very important center of commerce and trade, partly thanks to its port and partly thanks to the Via Egnatia. Unlike the other ancient cities of Greece, this one wasn't named after a god, but after a person who was alive at the time of its founding. Thessaloniki was the half-sister of Alexander the Great and the wife of King Cassander. Down on the city's bustling waterfront, It's Alexander who is commemorated with a particularly majestic statue, depicted sitting astride his famous horse, Bucephalus. The city walls have been rebuilt and reinforced many times, but some of the oldest gates remain, including this one on the Via Egnatia, and which consequently is most likely the one Paul passed through. It's called the Great Gate, not because it's particularly grand, but because of the association with the Apostle Paul. Rather more elaborate, though, is the Arch of Galerius, which also stands on the Via Egnatia. It commemorates the victory of the Emperor Galerius over the Persians, and the nearby rotunda was originally part of his mausoleum and is now the church of Agios Georgios. Being elevated, this area escaped a huge fire that destroyed many other parts of the city in August 1917, so the narrow paved streets, old squares and architectural styles of the Greek and Ottoman periods have been preserved. Also well preserved is the Byzantine period fortress called the Eptopyrion, obviously built here to make the most of a highly strategic position and subsequently extended by the Ottomans. As in Athens, the city's ancient agora subsequently became a Roman forum, and its remains are situated right in the heart of what's now modern Thessaloniki. Most of these ruins date from the time when the city served as the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia. This close proximity particularly emphasizes the contrast between the new and the old. It would be quite a privilege to look out over this site every day. These ruins include shops, civic buildings, and a circular bathhouse, but only a quarter of the original area has been excavated. The rest is still buried under the surrounding modern-era buildings. There's an underground museum on the site, accessed via the Cryptoporticus, a semi-subterranean corridor which was originally designed for the storage of perishables, as it allowed for the circulation of cooling air. Although under Roman control, ancient Thessaloniki was still run like a Greek city, with the three important components of a council, an assembly of the citizens, and a group of magistrates. As it happens, Paul managed to avoid prison in Thessaloniki, but he again raised the ire of the local authorities as his preaching started to get results. The book of Acts tells us that Paul went to the local synagogue on 3 Sabbaths, and that, I quote, "Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and not a few prominent women." Not a few, meaning many. As in Philippi, not all were happy with the progress Paul was making, and certainly not with his message about the new Messiah. So a lynch mob was rounded up to start a riot, presumably the pretext for giving him a severe beating. Paul and Silas kept out of sight, but Thessaloniki was no longer a safe place for him to be. So, under the cover of darkness, the pair left hurriedly, heading for Veria. At that time, Veria was an important staging post on the Via Egnatia. Immediately upon arriving in Veria, he made a beeline straight for the town synagogue and started preaching. If Veria wasn't on Paul's original itinerary, perhaps it should have been, because it was here that he experienced the most positive response of perhaps anywhere during his journeys in Greece. The book of Acts records that his message was received with great eagerness, and that many of the Jews believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women, as well as many Greek men. Today, very little of ancient Veria remains, but parts of the old Via Egnatia are still intact, right in the middle of the modern town. And it's again quite moving to think that the Apostle Paul walked on these very stones. St. Paul's short stay here is commemorated by a large monument erected in 1961 and said to be on the site of the synagogue where he was so well received. Inevitably, news of Paul's activities in Veria soon got back to his pursuers in Thessaloniki, and he had to move on, this time on his own. Although in the safe hands of sympathizers who escorted him to a sailing boat which would have taken them on to Athens. It would be 5 years before Paul returned to Macedonia, during which time the young churches at both Philippi and Thessaloniki struggled but survived. Paul continued to assist by remote control, writing a number of letters to them which contained advice and admonishments, and which are still used for guidance by today's Christian church. The seeds had been successfully sown. Such as here in a valley called Meteora in central Greece, where monasteries, some tiny, some larger, perch precariously atop pinnacles of sedimentary rock.
Meteora, perhaps most famous for being in the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only. That's certainly the first place I ever saw it. But it is one of the most extraordinary natural phenomena, those rocky sandstone crags lifting up into the heavens, but also an extraordinary testament to human achievement. From the 9th century AD, religious hermits were getting away from it all, living in the fissures of the rock. And by the 11th or 12th century, there was a permanent monastic presence there. And then in the 14th century, you get the building of the first great monastery on top of the Meteora crags. And in the turbulent times of the 14th and 15th centuries, as Greece became part of the expanding Ottoman Empire, it's no surprise that 20 monasteries were built in the safety of the tops of Meteora, all of them only reachable by ropes and rope ladders and massive rope baskets to bring up goods and other necessities. It must have been quite a terrifying experience to get up there, because the ropes were only replaced when the Lord had broken them. Today there are only 6 monasteries and nunneries, in fact, left on Meteora, but they stand at the forefront of an incredible history.
Here, perhaps, is the most visually dramatic realization of what flowered out of the seeds sown by Paul as he journeyed across Macedonia centuries before. This cluster of monasteries is surely symbolic of Christianity's solid foundations in Greece. Had Paul made his journey to Athens overland, he may well have stopped at Delphi. Perhaps one of the most important archaeological sites in Greece, and certainly one of the most spectacular. Dating back to around 500 BC, Delphi occupies a series of terraces and slopes on the side of Mount Parnassos. So the views are panoramic across the Plistos Valley and round to the Gulf of Corinth. In Greek mythology, the location was selected by Zeus after he determined that this represented the absolute center of the earth. It subsequently came to be most associated with Apollo, the son of Zeus, and the god of light and the sun. The sanctuary of Apollo is a concentrated dose of ancient history, and packed into a quite small area is a temple, an open-air theatre, many treasuries resembling mini-temples, a Roman agora, a stoa, and numerous statues. All this can be navigated via the sacred way which winds its way through the ruins. It's lined on either side with the treasuries which were paid for by various city-states, including Athens. In them was stored some of the loot from battles given as gifts to Apollo in thanks for the victories. The theatre dates from the 4th century BC and is located a little higher up the slope. So it provides a breathtaking view of the site and beyond. What was ever happening on this stage would have had to be very good to hold the audience's attention.
Delphi was, from the 8th century BC, an absolutely crucial sanctuary because it was home to an an oracle of the god Apollo, the son of Zeus. And to this oracle, to find out indications of what might lie ahead in the future and what the gods had in store, kings, potentates, tyrants, and the everyday people of the ancient world came flocking. For 1,000 years, Delphi was the center of the world, the place to go to find out about what the future had in store. It was also a place of athletic and musical competitions on par with the Olympics. And over the centuries, it became a sanctuary full of gold, silver, ivory, bronze, a marvel to look at. And that sanctuary attracted Roman emperors, and indeed survived even into the Christian era, when those canny Delphians began to convert their pagan temples into Christian churches.
In the museum at Delphi is one of the best-known surviving statues from ancient Greece, the charioteer, also known as Iniokos. He's made from bronze, 1.8 meters tall, and commemorated the winning of a chariot race. Other fragments found with him indicate the whole work originally comprised the chariot, 4 horses, and 2 drivers, which would have looked very impressive indeed. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi was destroyed in AD 390 by the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I, primarily in order to silence the famous oracle of Delphi. The Delphi oracle was just one of many long-practiced pagan rituals and beliefs that came to an end as Christianity swept across Europe. And it had all started with one man. Paul experienced both highs and lows during his journeys through Greek Macedonia, and he was rarely in one place for very long, sowing the seeds of Christianity he fervently hoped would become established and flourish after he was gone. He was only in Athens for a short time too, before heading a little further west to the city of Corinth. Here, he ended up staying for 18 months, and even set up a business making tents. So, what was different about Corinth? We'll find out next. At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. In this program, we've traveled to the southernmost part of the Greek mainland, to an area known as the Peloponnese. It's a peninsula with an area of close to 21,500 square kilometers, and it's linked to central Greece by a very narrow isthmus. In geographical terms, it's akin to a very thin thread, so the Peloponnese is actually more like a large island, which means its coastline and beaches are a major attraction. But this is also a place of snow-capped mountains, vineyards and olive groves, and of course, a rich variety of historical sites. Over the next 2 millennia, feudal city-states were established across the region, the most powerful of them being Sparta. But others were important too, including Corinth, which is where we once again encounter the Apostle Paul. On his missionary journeys, Paul rarely stayed anywhere more than a couple of months, but he made Corinth his home and even set up a business there. Traveling west from Athens, as Paul would have done towards the end of AD 50, the overland route to Corinth crosses the narrow isthmus which today is pierced through the middle by the Corinth Canal. Completed in 1893, It took 11 years to cut down through the limestone to sea level. There are no locks, and the canal is just 24.6 meters wide. But by connecting the Aegean Sea to the Gulf of Corinth, it bypassed a 350-kilometer sail around the Peloponnese coast. Due to the narrowness, which is accentuated by the sheer banks rising to 70 meters at some points, any ship over 800 tons has to be towed through the Corinth Canal, and perhaps not surprisingly, there's a toll to pay. The current changes direction every 6 hours with the tides and has a near constant speed of 2.5 knots. Particularly unusual are 2 submersible road bridges, one at each end of the canal, which drop into the water to allow vessels to proceed. If you have a spare hour, it's a remarkable procedure to watch. When Paul arrived in Corinth, the Peloponnese was under the control of the Romans, who had captured the entire peninsula by 146 BC. The city's location at the end of this narrow strip had both strategic and commercial importance. Most of the ancient Hellenistic city was destroyed by the Romans as they invaded. But in 44 BC, Julius Caesar re-established Corinth as a major settlement. By the time Paul arrived, it was once again a thriving center of commerce and politics. But unlike either Athens or Thessaloniki, it was essentially a modern, cosmopolitan city with a much more progressive outlook and less rooted in either mythology or traditional ways of thinking. It also had a long-held reputation for sexual immorality, although this had diminished under Roman rule. On one hand, then, Paul may well have hoped that the free-thinking Corinthians might be more receptive to his message. On the other, the city's reputation for a less inhibited lifestyle would have disturbed him and possibly represented more of a challenge than overcoming the worship of pagan gods. Any doubts he may have had about staying in Corinth were soon put to rest by a vision from God. Appearing to Paul one night, God says in the book of Acts, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." Any view of ancient Corinth is dominated by the Acro-Corinth, a substantial rocky outcrop on top of which was built the archaic period Acropolis, including a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Joining us again is Dr. Michael Scott.
Acro-Corinth, one of the most dominating landscapes in central Greece. The mountaintop overlooking the isthmus, the joining corridor between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. For centuries, from archaic times right the way through to the 19th century, the seat of a fortress, a citadel, to guard over, oversee, control this major crossing point. In archaic times, it was a city that had at its heart a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, sex, and fertility. And one of the ancient writers tells us a rather curious story about this temple, that it was home to 1,000 prostitutes. The sailors putting into the port of Corinth down below seem to have been having a very good time indeed. But the protective city walls of that archaic fortress were felled by the Romans when they took charge of Greece in 146 BC, and when they destroyed Corinth and everything in the surrounds to make a very bold statement about their dominance. Those walls weren't rebuilt, indeed, until the Byzantine period, when once again Acro-Corinth became the fortress citadel that protected, controlled, and guarded over the crucial crossing point of Greece.
Paul would have undoubtedly seen this as he entered the city, and although the temple was in ruins, he'd know of its associations with mass prostitution. Rising to over 500 meters, the Acro-Corinth was easy to defend, and so particularly during the later Byzantine period, it was very heavily fortified. The ruins of ancient Corinth seen today are mostly of the Roman settlement as rebuilt by Julius Caesar, and so much of the layout would have been very familiar to Paul after he made the city his home. There are very few relics here from the 600 years of Greek activity, but the one notable exception is what remains of the Temple of Apollo, with its 7 surviving Doric pillars, and which dates back to around 540 BC. There were originally 38 pillars, each monolithic, which means they were hewn from a single piece of stone rather than built up in round sections, which is more commonly seen in ancient Greek temples, including the Parthenon. Excavations began on this site in 1896 and have since gone on continuously, interrupted only by the Second World War. Virtually everything that can be seen here has been uncovered during the last 100 years. In addition to the civic buildings of the Roman era, a notable element of these ruins is the number of buildings that served as shops, reminders of the city's role as a key commercial center. Jason Harris, a visiting assistant professor from Tulane University in Los Angeles, has worked on the site of ancient Corinth for several years and is particularly aware of its significance.
I've had the privilege of working for several years here at the excavations in the museum and seeing really firsthand the wonders and the amazing sort of process it is to discover all of these finds, whether they're the temples, whether they're coins, pottery, all sorts of various finds here. So it's really also interesting at these sites like Corinth, Olympia, the Acropolis in Athens to understand the modern history of the excavations, how they played into the modern Greek state, and also how cultural heritage really plays a role in creating a relationship between the past and the present.
Alongside the old road to Corinth's western side harbour at Lechion is what was once an arcade of shops, and these provide a very good idea of how small retail operations would have looked like when Paul started plying his trade here. The Book of Acts says he met a couple called Aquila and Priscilla, who along with the entire Jewish population of Rome had been expelled by the Emperor Claudius. The writer of Acts notes, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them.
So when Paul came for approximately 18 months, from 51 to 52 AD, what he found was a very large city of several 100,000 people that was very, very cosmopolitan in nature, with various religions living together, including Greeks, Romans, and many Jews, many of whom had come from Rome in 49 AD when they had been expelled by the Emperor Claudius. And so really, when you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, what you see is Paul dialoguing with the Corinthian people about really what it means to live in a contemporary world, to reconcile their beliefs with the customs of the Greeks and the Romans around them. So really the site of Corinth, as an important political and economic center in the Roman Empire, really provides a place for us to see the relationship between reconciling one's Christian beliefs and contemporary culture. And so you see this relationship that Paul has with the church, trying to understand how he can connect the church with the culture, especially not only just reconciling Christianity with Greek and Roman religion, but also Christianity and Judaism, because the many Jews that were here were not necessarily fans of Paul and what he was doing, as we see in Acts 18.
Could all this normality last for Paul? Of course not. Eventually, a group of Jews attack him and bring him before the region's proconsul, or governor, Gallus. Paul is accused of persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Here, in the center of what would have been the Roman agora, or forum, Paul was stood in front of a bema to face judgment. In his letters to both the Romans and the Corinthians, Paul referred to the bema as God's judgment seat, before which all must eventually stand. Paul no doubt thanked God for his acquittal, as the alternative could have been jail, but it's more likely to have been a public flogging. This was particularly barbaric, as you were stripped and then chained to a stone column as if you were embracing it, thus fully baring your back for maximum exposure to the lash. Near the bema at Corinth is an inscription in both English and Greek. "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison." Providing a very tangible link with the New Testament is a small slab of stone bearing an inscription. It's part of a pavement, and the inscription commemorates the person who paid to have it laid, a wealthy politician called Erastus. Once you've absorbed the big picture at Corinth, the fascinating archaeological museum on the site fills in many of the smaller details. Built in the early 1930s, it houses an extensive collection of finds from the many decades of excavations, including household items and artworks from vases to figurines, many of them distinctly Corinthian in character and style. Near the entrance is a welcoming committee of headless statues, which, as they're wearing togas, would have been of notable Roman citizens. The Book of Acts tells us that after appearing before Gallus, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. But eventually he decided it was time to leave. We're told he went to the harbour at Kenthria, which is on the eastern side of the city. Before setting sail, he had all his hair cut off in order to fulfill a vow. There's not much of the ancient harbour at Kenthria left now, except for a few foundations. But it's not hard to imagine Paul sitting here at the water's edge while a barber shaved his head. We're not sure what the vow was about, but it's been suggested that Paul may have been giving thanks for the protection God had promised him 18 months ago, and had very clearly provided. By now, Paul was much more notorious for his fearless preaching of the gospel, and forces were gathering against him. As he again prepared to sail once more from this harbour, this time to Jerusalem, word arrived of a plot to murder him, so the voyage was abandoned, and instead, he set off eastwards on foot. Now, that was going to be quite a walk, but it didn't seem to deter Paul. Undoubtedly, one of the most famous locations on the Peloponnese is here at ancient Olympia, the location of the original Olympic Games. These games were staged every 4 years, from 776 BC to AD 394. The idea being that all nations forgot their differences for a little while and came together in the spirit of sporting competition. What is particularly interesting about Olympia is that it was built specifically for the Games, and so there wasn't a resident population.
Olympia is best known as the home of the Olympic Games, those centres of incredible competition, sweat, blood, tears that went every 4 years from 776 BC, the first ever Olympic Games, and which continue all the way through to today. But that kind of competition was not actually the only kind of competition going on at Olympia. Olympia was a sanctuary to the god Zeus, king of the gods, and as a result was a very valuable piece of property, of real estate. And different Greek cities fought one another to have control of the sanctuary. When it was excavated, there are literally black layers of ash, which are moments when another city has got control of it, burn everything to the ground, and just started again building. This is a place that had competition in its essence, in its lifeblood. And it managed to survive all the way through changes of powers. So when the Romans took over Greece, they absolutely loved the Olympic Games. The Emperor Nero even came to compete in the Olympic Games, and strangely enough, won every event that he entered. And even when the Roman era gave way to the Christian era, Olympia managed to survive, for some time at least, until in the 5th or 6th centuries AD, finally, the competitors stopped competing.
After the games were banned by the Christian emperor Theodosius I, the site was progressively abandoned and subsequently ravaged by both earthquakes and floods until it all but disappeared. It was rediscovered in 1766, and excavations began in 1829, uncovering a complex of temples, treasuries, hostels, baths, and of course, sports venues. This is the Palestra, where the wrestlers and boxers were trained, and it's part of a group of buildings that were known collectively as the Gymnasium. The word gymnos, or gymnos in Greek, means naked, and the athletes in these times trained and competed in the nude. The Palestra was built around a courtyard which served as the training area, and in the building were dressing rooms, baths, and storage areas. The main stadium at Olympia is now just a flat area, but it would have originally been surrounded by a racetrack and had many tiers of seats made from mud arranged on either side. The very first games were held in honor of Zeus, the god of sky and thunder, and the temples uncovered on the site of ancient Olympia are to him and his wife Ira. It's here, at the temple of Ira, that the Olympic flame is lit by concentrating the rays of the sun with a parabolic mirror, and the torch then heads off on a relay around the world to the location of the summer or winter games. The games were still an important part of life in Greece when St. Paul was here, and he later used sporting analogies in some of his writing, including in his letter to the church at Philippi when he says, "I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus." Late afternoon light really bring these ruins to life on a summer day. A little further down the west coast of the Peloponnese is the small town of Pylos, often described in the guidebooks as the most picturesque on the peninsula. This is quite an accolade, as this part of the peninsula has more than its fair share of beautiful seaside towns, but Pylos is indeed a gem among them. While it dates back to Mycenaean times, Pylos is more famous for an episode from more recent history. At the time of the Greek War of Independence, Pylos was called Navarino. And, as had been the case for many centuries, its beautiful bay was once again considered strategically important. A large Ottoman armada was at anchor in the harbour at Pylos when a small but well-armed flotilla of just 13 ships from France, England and Russia started manoeuvres, primarily aimed at convincing the Turks to comply with the newly signed Treaty of London.
In 1821, the Greeks decided that they had had enough of Ottoman rule that had been going on since about 1453. And so began the Greek resistance. But this was fiercely opposed by the Ottomans. Greece was an important economic part of their empire, but also strategically, if Greece left, who would be next? And the Greeks were frankly outnumbered, outgunned and outspent. By 1825, 1827, their cause had advanced very little and looked frankly desperate. But what came to their aid was a wider geopolitical power play. Russia was very keen to see Greece liberated from the Ottoman Empire, not just because they shared an Orthodox Catholic faith with Greece, but because they saw an opportunity to expand their own power from the Black Sea downwards into the Mediterranean. Britain and France, on the other hand, were very keen that Russia did not expand its influence in such a way. And so in 1827, Britain, France and Russia agreed in a treaty that they would help Greece on the condition that as a result, Greece remained autonomous, free. And so the Battle of Navarino came about on the 20th of October, 1827, between the forces of the Ottoman Empire and the combined warships of Britain, France and Russia. That was the last battle in history to be fought entirely by sailing ships, although in reality it was the firepower of Britain, France and Russia that won the day.
It's said that the bay turned red. The Battle of Navarino is credited with saving the fledgling Greek Republic from collapse, and some of the wrecks of the Turkish vessels are still discernible in the clear waters, now back to their customary aquamarine. However, they do glow red again during the bay's legendary sunsets. Across the Gulf of Macedonia is the Mani region, a rugged peninsula of steep mountains and valleys, sheer cliffs and rocky beaches, and sturdy little villages, seemingly hanging on for dear life. This is Greece at its wildest, and because of the inaccessibility and the challenging terrain, Christianity came much later to this region. Additionally, the local people, known as the Maniotes, were fiercely independent as well as being highly superstitious. So it wasn't until the 10th century that Christian missionaries made many significant inroads. So, when Christianity finally conquered Greece's harshest region, it did so decisively and comprehensively, much like had happened in the rest of the country in the centuries before. In the Peloponnese, it all started with Paul's first visit to Corinth, where, although there was some opposition, his message resonated with enough people, and from different walks of society, to ensure it would spread across Greece and out to the wider world. Leaving the southern end of the Peloponnese, we head back to Athens, so we can sail from the port of Piraeus south into the Aegean Sea, heading for the glorious Greek islands with their evocative palettes of blue and white and reputation for thoroughly enthralling visitors. Passing through the magnificent Cycladic Islands, it would be tempting to stop, but our destination is the farthest group called the Dodecanese. These islands are closer to the Turkey's western coastline than they are to the Greek mainland. The largest in the group is Rhodes, a distillation of all Greece's many attractions into one highly concentrated experience. But we are also interested in Patmos, which has a very special association with the Bible. In the next Ancient Bible destinations, we'll be traveling further south to visit the famous Greek islands that made up the Dodecanese group. And here, apart from some of the most spectacular scenery on the planet, we'll encounter St. John, the last of the 12 disciples still alive, in exile, and writing the most controversial book of the New Testament. At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. Described as the sunniest corner in Greece, The Dodecanese group comprises 12 larger islands with numerous smaller ones dotted in between. Here are the sparkling beaches that make these islands one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Mediterranean. But these islands also have a rich cultural variety, born out of a long and sometimes tumultuous history. Much of this history parallels what was happening on the mainland. So these islands were first inhabited and civilized through the Archaic and Classical periods, eventually becoming part of the voracious Roman Empire. Following its demise in the 4th century AD, there was nearly a millennium of Byzantine rule. Subsequent periods of control by the Venetians, the Catholic Knights Hospitaller, the Ottomans and the Italians have all left their distinctive marks on the Dodecanese Islands. Dominating the central harbour area, the medieval old town is one of the finest examples in Europe, earning a listing as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. The fortifications are Byzantine in origins, but the Knights Hospitaller, who arrived on Rhodes in 1309, undertook a massive program of upgrading and expansion, eventually creating 3 lines of solid defence. Particularly fascinating is the Street of the Knights, lined with the hostels called the Inns of the Tongues, where each of the 7 different nationalities of the order stayed. Each bears the respective tongue's emblem, carved in stone above the arched entrance.
In the 7th century AD, a group was formed in Jerusalem to look after the sick and ill pilgrims who had managed to make their way to the Holy City. And in the aftermath of the First Crusade in the 11th century, that group was transformed from a group of doctors into a military fighting force whose job it was to protect the pilgrims and protect Christendom's hold over the Holy Lands. These were the Knights Hospitaller. And their power and influence grew in the Levant and the Holy Land exponentially over the following centuries. But then, in the 13th century, they were chased out of the Holy Land by the Ottoman Turks. They needed a new base. First, they landed on Cyprus, but soon their eyes turned to the island of Rhodes, and in 1309, they took the island by force. The city of Rhodes on Rhodes was, as a result, transformed into a medieval fortress, and there the knights, now called the Knights of Rhodes, remained until the 16th century, when in 1522 they were once again chased from their homes by the Ottoman Turks.
Head a little further south and the road takes you to Lindos. Surely the realization of everybody's imaginings of the classic whitewashed Greek village hugging an ocean of brilliant blue. In fact, Lindos is built around not one, but 2 equally beautiful bays, so there are 2 stretches of beach to choose from. The more sheltered of these inlets is called St. Paul's Bay, and it's claimed the apostle took refuge here from a storm in AD 43, and by happy accident bringing Christianity to the island of Rhodes. While there isn't much evidence to back up this story, Paul certainly would have sailed through these waters on both his 2nd and 3rd missionary journeys, passing quite close to Rhodes, so it might have happened. And one legacy is a very pretty little chapel dedicated to the apostle, nestling at the base of the Acropolis. While the beaches are a major attraction of Lindos, its spectacular ancient Acropolis is well worth a visit too. Rising to 120 meters above the village, access is by long flights of stone steps ending in a vaulted corridor. There's a lot to see up here, including the remaining columns of a stoa, originating from around 200 BC, and a propylaeum or monumental gateway dating from the 5th century BC. Beyond are the ruins of the Temple of Athena of Lindos, the most important on the site, and from 300 BC.
The Acropolis on the eastern end of the island of Rhodes is dedicated to the goddess Athena and particularly to Athena Lindia. Now, this was an incredible sanctuary, and a very savvy one by my bet. It had a beautiful temple and other sanctuary architecture, but then in about the 1st century BC, it suffered a disaster. Everything that it owned was burnt by fire. And as a result, what could this sanctuary say to those coming to the island about its former glory? Their answer was a brilliant one. They started writing inventory lists of every dedication that had ever been bought by anyone in the past. And basically, they made it up. Every single important character in the whole of Greek mythology and Greek history supposedly had turned up to the Acropolis of Athena Lindia and dedicated something in the sanctuary. The Romans, when they started coming, took note of these lists and wanted to be on them themselves. And so this brilliant history continued right the way through into the 14th century AD, when the new owners of Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of Rhodes, decided to turn the Acropolis of Athena Lindia into a new fortress.
Sharp-eyed film buffs may recognize that scenes from the Guns of Navarone were filmed here, although the movie's plot is actually inspired by the Battle of Leros, which took place during the Dodecanese campaign in the Second World War. The real island of Leros is at the northern end of the Dodecanese group and possesses the largest natural harbour in the eastern Mediterranean. During the 1930s, the Italians turned it into a naval base, and Mussolini subsequently positioned both ships and seaplanes here during the Second World War. Gun emplacements were put in place to defend the base, and when Italy changed sides in July 1943, a British force arrived as reinforcements. The Battle of Leros took place during the following September, as the Germans mounted many attempts to take the island. Remains of the gun batteries can still be seen on the island's cliffs, but today these are very serene locations and perfect places to watch another magical Aegean sunset. Today, Leros is a very peaceful place, its landscapes punctuated by little whitewashed chapels, like this beautiful little example, the church of Aios Isidros, built on a rocky islet on the Gulf of Kokali. In bad weather or high seas, it's often cut off from shore. The capital of Leros, Aia Marina, is notable for its distinctly Italianate architectural style, although you'll still find plenty of traditional whitewashed cottages in the neighboring villages of Platanos and Pandeli. Aia Marina is a port too, and its beautiful harbour's entrance is flanked by an old Roman fort called the Bruzzi, and an historical windmill which almost appears to be rising straight out of the water and can be seen from all parts of the island. Towering over all of it is the brooding presence of the Castro tis Panagias, the Castle of the Virgin Mary. Again, Byzantine in origins and later modified by the Knights Hospitaller. Built into the west side of the fortress is the 17th century Panagia Church, also dedicated to Mary. Secluded beaches, gentle green hills, olive groves and pine forests endow Leros with a great natural beauty, and it's often described as Greece's secret paradise. And from any high point in the distance to the north can be seen the island of Patmos, which is only a short ferry ride away. Patmos is known variously as the Island of the Apocalypse, the Holy Island, or the Jerusalem of the Aegean. These are all references to the most famous of its historical residents, the Apostle John, who was exiled here in AD 95 by the pagan Roman Emperor Domitian, Patmos is remote by any measure, although its popularity with both tourists and Christian pilgrims alike means it's a lot easier to get to than when John was left to languish here. There are direct connections with Rhodes and Athens, as well as links to the other main islands in the Dodecanese group. This remoteness is the very reason the Romans in particular used Patmos as a place to exile political and religious dissidents. Patmos is a small island, but there's still a lot to see, much of it related to St. John. In fact, on this tiny island, there are said to be a total of 365 churches. There's also a remarkable variety of landscapes for such a small area, from wind-blown hills to calm coves, rocky outcrops to smooth beaches, and dry, barren slopes to lush groves of citrus trees, olives, and vines. But beyond the physical, this island has a mystical quality and a tranquil beauty that's spellbinding, especially when the sun is setting, bathing everything in soft, warm hues. In fact, walking up the steep hill from the shore to the cave where John was exiled is a most moving and spiritual experience. The first settlement dates back to 2000 BC, but it was the Ionians who brought a higher level of civilization in the 4th century, establishing a port town now called Scala, with an acropolis on the nearby Castelli Hill. Patmos developed into a trading center, but once the Romans took control in the 2nd century AD, it was better known as a place of exile. But one exile, John, would have a significant influence on the island's future right up to today. Almost 1,000 years after John, a monk called Christodoulos came here in 1088 from the island of Kos, seeking solitude in the tranquility of Patmos. He wrote, "The loneliness of the island made me jump for joy." With the blessing of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Christodoulos established a small monastery dedicated to the apostle, although he died before it could be completed. His followers finished the job, and this monastery was subsequently considered so sacred that it was even respected by the invading Ottomans and allowed to continue. Today, the fortress monastery dominates the skyline behind the narrow bay of Scala, its forbidding grey stone walls contrasting dramatically with the bright white of the houses in the surrounding village of Chora. When John was on Patmos, it wasn't uncommon for the exiles to live in one of the many caves on the island. It needs to be remembered that he was well into his 80s and most likely no longer capable of building a proper dwelling. A cave would have been a welcome refuge, if perhaps an uncomfortable one. Today, the Monastery of the Apocalypse stands over the cave where John is thought to have lived. Over the entrance to the cave is an inscription which reads, "As dreadful as this place is, it is nevertheless the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." In the cool darkness of this cave, John began seeing the visions that have subsequently formed the most controversial and most debated writings in the entire Holy Bible, the Book of Revelation. These visions were prophetic and told of the end of times, using symbolism that would have been understood by the readers of the day and surrealism that has remained open to different interpretations ever since. At the start of the Book of Revelation, John writes, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, "Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches." In Greek, the word apocalypsis means revelation, and its English derivation, apocalypse, has come to imply destruction and devastation. God's revelation to John was essentially a message of hope. At least for the faithful who were promised that their persecutors would be destroyed, while they would be rewarded with eternal life. In the cave chapel can be seen the niche carved into the rock where John rested his head, and another which he used to pull himself up after waking. Another reminder that he was a very old man. For the many thousands of pilgrims who visit here every year, this is a very sacred spot. In the low ceiling are the clearly discernible fissures in the rock through which, according to tradition, John heard the voice of God. The wall paintings are from the 12th century, but were only discovered in 1973 when whitewash was removed. It's considered such a crucially important place in Christianity that a priest lives, sleeps, and stands guard here all year round, taking his appointed role very seriously. The current incumbent has been doing the job for over 20 years. Away from the bright Aegean light and the noises of everyday life, this quiet cave really concentrates the senses on the story of Revelation with its message of reassurance for believers. No wonder it's considered such a significant and sacred place in Christianity. Services are held here by the resident priest every day, and to attend one is a very moving experience.
Now, fairly soon after John's death, that cave started to become a place of Christian pilgrimage. And by about the 4th century AD, there seems to have been a church there to help celebrate the sanctity of the spot. But Patmos's history over the subsequent centuries was a very difficult one, as it was thrown between the different powers that controlled the Aegean. And it wasn't until the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, that we actually get a monastery there to celebrate the sanctity of the place, the monastery that still survives to this day.
The village of Chora is clustered around the fortified monastery. It's full of tiny squares and courtyards, narrow alleyways just waiting to be explored, beautifully restored period homes, and the promise of stunning views from every vantage point. Closer to the monastery, Chora's architecture is predominantly Byzantine and has been the subject of much study because of its particular character and style. These houses were built by refugees from the sacking of Constantinople in 1453, and so their urban-like density is unusual for what was then an entirely rural environment. Further down the slopes, the character changes again as many of the buildings are freestanding mansions built in the 16th and 17th centuries during the Ottoman occupation. Most originally sat in large gardens, which have subsequently been occupied by smaller homes. The monastery itself feels very much like the refuge it was originally intended to be. While the outside world can be viewed in all its glory from the top of the walls, down in the courtyards and sheltered spaces, the focus is inward-looking and more contemplative. The interior of the main church is dominated by a carved wooden iconostasi, breathtaking in its intricacy and detail. It's early 19th century, but the building is the original, completed in 1095. The many chandeliers and lamps are made from silver, while the floor slabs are marble. On the roof terrace is the small domed chapel of the Holy Cross, built in 1558 and made from rough-cut stone. From up here, the whole of Patmos is spread out before you. A church of rather smaller proportions, but considered no less important in the story of St. John's time on Patmos, sits right on the harbour at Scala. It's built on the site where John baptized the first converts to Christianity on the island. One of the most unusual is on a large rock formation called Kallikatsu. It sits in the bay of Petra, not far from the very popular beaches at the village of Grikos. In medieval times, monks lived as hermits in small caves hewn into the rock, and there was even a small church here in the 11th century. Also known as Petra Rock, it's thought that the ancient residents of Patmos used the flat platform at the top as a place to worship Selene, the goddess of the moon. The monks carved steps into the rock, and the views of the bay from the top make the tricky climb well worth the effort. Another distinctive architectural feature of Patmos, as on many of the Greek islands, is its cylindrical stone windmills. These are from the 16th and 17th centuries and were carefully positioned to make the most of the prevailing northerly winds. Unlike in northern Europe, fabric sails were used instead of rigid vanes, but the effect was the same, driving a large grinding wheel to make flour from wheat, barley, or corn. After being abandoned in the 1950s and becoming derelict, these 3 windmills on the edge of Hora have been lovingly restored and are in working order today. St. John lived on Patmos for around 18 months, and after the Emperor Domitian was murdered in AD 96, it's believed he was returned to his home in Ephesus, leaving this little island a remarkable legacy, which has profoundly influenced its existence today. Beyond this, he left Christianity with an even more enduring legacy, which continues to underpin the faith in the most trying of times. There can be few places on the planet that compare to Patmos for its intoxicating mix of deep spirituality, sheer physical beauty, and wonderfully relaxed lifestyle. Devout Greeks believe that you should visit Patmos at least once in your lifetime, and it's hard not to agree. But sadly, it is here that we must leave Greece and its living history. From Christianity's first tentative steps into Europe, when St. Paul must have felt on many occasions overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead, to the resounding reassurances awaiting the faithful as revealed to St. John, as he too must have been struggling with his situation on Patmos, Greece is hugely significant in biblical terms. Athens, Thessaloniki, Veria, Philippi, Corinth, and Patmos are all very significant places in the New Testament story, but if St. Paul was to visit Greece today, he would surely be astounded at how Christianity is such an integral part of the nation's life, from the major urban centers to the remotest of islands. But then perhaps he wouldn't be. Perhaps Paul's faith was always strong enough to believe that the message he brought just could not be ignored. And St. John's visions of the future must have convinced him too that what he was writing had implications for eternity. These were real people, and these are real places, which you can visit today for a truly inspirational experience. The ancient Bible destinations are a trip of a lifetime, or very possibly a life-changing trip.
like the sun and the rain, to soften these dark wounds, to bring life again. Oh God, my joy, oh God, my hope, Lord God, my strength, oh God, my peace, oh God, my joy, oh God, my hope. I will rest in the wonder of my God's grace for me. God who brings comfort, oh God who sends grace, grace for the weary and mercy for me, who heals and restores like the sun and the rain, to soften